Good evening. Welcome back to our Sunday night Bible study. We are looking through Christian doctrine or Christian theology, currently looking at the doctrine of man or biblical anthropology, but since today is Halloween, I thought I would look at the history of Halloween. As you know, or may not know, Halloween is a very old celebration. It dates back to the pagan times of the pre-Roman Empire. The name itself, Halloween, H-A-L-L, not Halloween, but Halloween, dates to 835 A.D., when Pope Gregory IV designated November 1st as All Saints' Day or All Hallows' Day. All Saints' Day was a time for the church to remember the Christian dead. But the solemn remembrance didn't actually commence on November 1st. It began on the evening of October 31st. This was called All Hallows' Eve or Halloween. Now, Halloween, as we understand it in America, is largely based on the Celtic paganism of old Europe. Long before the Catholic Church established All Saints' Day, some 2,000 years ago or less, the ancient pagan Celts of Gaul, Britain, and Ireland celebrated the end of summer, typically on October 31st, with an autumnal festival called Samhain, which means summer's end, I should say. Now, Samhain is spelled S-A-M-H-A-I-N, but it's pronounced Samhain. And the Celtic people divided their year into two halves, day and night, or summer and winter. And accordingly, their two main celebrations centered on these two halves, summer, light, winter, darkness. The light half of the year is Beltane, B-E-L-T-A-N-E is one way to spell it. And of course the dark half of the year, or winter, was Samhain. Sir James Frazer, in his book The Golden Bough, A Study of Magic and Religion, explains that the principal fire festivals of the Celts, now fire festival was a fire of sacrifice or of purification. The principal fire festivals of the Celtic people, he says, were seemingly timed without any reference to the position of the sun in the heavens. They were two in number and fell at an interval of 6 months, one being celebrated on the eve of May Day and the other on All Hallow Even, or Halloween, on the 31st of October. On the evening of May 1st, the Celts celebrated the beginning of summer with the festival of Beltane, or Baal fire, offered to the pagan god Baal, the one in the Bible. Sometimes Baal, B-A-A-L, is spelled B-E-L. Beltane marked the end of the dark half of the year, when the horn god Cernunnos, relinquished his power at the beginning of the light half of the year, or summer, or the time of the great goddess. Likewise, on the evening of October 31st, the Celts celebrated Samhain to mark the end of summer and the time when the goddess relinquished her power to the winter god, thus marking the beginning of winter, or the dark half of the year. The celebration of Samhain was the more important of the two main Celtic festivals, Beltane and Samhain. Samhain was the most important of the two because it marked the beginning of a new year. So as such, Samhain was the time for divination, to discern the future. The responsibility for divining omens for the upcoming year belonged to the Celtic priest class that were called Druids. The Druids used many techniques to foretell the future. They would meditate, they would study the flight of birds in the sky, they would interpret dreams, and they would throw sticks on the ground and interpret the pattern of the sticks. Now, according to Julius Caesar's account of the Druids in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, which was written half a century before the time of Christ, speaks of the Druids as having charge not only of worship and sacrifice, but were, quote, in addition, physicians, historians, teachers, scientists, and judges. So the Druids were a very influential class among the Celtic peoples. And when Rome invaded northern Europe, it was the Druidic priests that incited the Celtic people to resist them. Now, the name Druid is probably derived from an Old Welsh or Gaelic term for an oak tree. Druid, Druidh, which, and I'm probably not saying it right, but it means seer or sage. And so this word implies that the Druids were those who knew the wisdom of the trees. Druid was connected, the word Druid is connected to the Greek word for oak, drus, D-R-U-S. The oak tree was held sacred by the Druidic priests, and their ceremonies were held often in oak groves. The oak tree, along with many other types of trees, had been sacred to pagan peoples for millennia. For example, the ancient Greeks believed that the gods answered their questions using signs in nature, and these were called omens. At the oracle of Zeus and Dodona, a worshipper would write down their question and give it to the priest, who would then listen to the rustling of the leaves in the oak trees and then would tell them the answer of the gods. So not only was the evening of October 31st the ideal time to divine the future, Halloween was the time of year, according to Fraser, quote, when the souls of the departed were supposed to revisit their old homes in order to warm themselves by the fire and to comfort themselves with the good cheer provided for them in the kitchen or parlor by their affectionate kinfolk. So the ghosts of the departed kin were not the only unseen spirits that haunted the evening on October 31st. Fraser continues that witches then sped on their errands of mischief, some sweeping through the air on their besoms, which is the brooms, others galloping along the roads on tabby cats, which for that evening are turned into coal-black steeds. The fairies, too, are all let loose, and hobgoblins of every sort roam freely about. Cats were sacred animals to the Celtic people. A line from the Book of Halloween reads, quote, a slender black cat reclining on a gold chain of silver guarded treasure in the old days. So although cats were considered sacred, they were also dreaded signs, for they believed that human beings had been changed into that form by evil means. Of course, for witches, it's in the lore that cats were their familiar spirits or whatever. So other Celtic superstitions associated with Halloween, according to Kelly, in the Book of Halloween, included the belief that on the last night of the old year, which is October 31st, for them, the Lord of Death gathered together the souls of all those who had died in the passing year and had been condemned to live in the bodies of animals to decree what forms they should inhabit for the next 12 months. He could be coaxed, that is, the Lord of Death could be coaxed to give a lighter sentence by gifts and by prayers. As far as Halloween in America, it made its way to this country during the massive wave of Irish immigration during the potato famine of the 1840s. Michael Russell, in an article entitled Halloween, an Ancient Celebration, states, from Irish and English traditions, Americans began dressing up in costumes and going house to house asking for food or money. And that by the end of the 19th century, many people began to try to mold Halloween into a holiday that was more about community and community celebrations rather than spirits, pranks, and witchcraft. Parents were encouraged to make the parties for their children and families less frightening and attempt to take out the fearful aspects of Halloween. Today, Halloween has become a part of the cultural fabric of American society. Halloween is the second biggest commercial holiday in America next to Christmas. Annually, Americans spend between $4 and $6 billion on celebrating Halloween with candy, costumes, decorations, and parties. Now, while many Americans consider the celebration of Halloween nothing more than innocent fun for children or just another excuse for grown-ups to have a party, what we need to understand from a Christian perspective is that every aspect of Halloween is firmly rooted in ancient paganism, and it's typically the paganism of the Celtic peoples and their celebration of Samhain, the end of summer, the last day of the year. So in the next section, what we're going to look at are the pagan roots behind many of our Halloween traditions. Take the witch's broom or her besom. The besom or the broom was placed by the hearth to protect the opening of the hearth and the house from evil spirits. In the old religion, as it's called, the besom was used to sweep away negativity from the magic circle. A magic circle was where the witches practiced his or her conjuring. The circle not only kept the unwanted spirits out, but it also kept in the magic energy or the power. In his book, Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft, Raymond Buckland writes the origin of the witch's besom. An old ritual act of fertility was for the villagers to go to the fields in the light of the full moon and to dance around the field astride pitchforks, poles, and broomsticks, riding them like hobby horses. They would leap high in the air as they danced to show the crops how high to grow. Of course, Buckland is a practicing witch himself. He died, I believe, in 2017. He's English, and he is responsible, many say, for bringing Wicca into this country years ago. As far as the besom goes and the superstition attached to its fertility rites to make the crops grow, one quote reads, in Bohemia, that the corn will grow as high as the flying... let me start that over. It was said that in Bohemia, the corn will grow as high as they fling the blazing besoms in the air. So you catch the broom on fire, throw it in the air, and as high as it goes, the crop should go that high. Okay, let's look at jack-o'-lanterns. October 31st was, for the ancient Celts, a holy time. They believed that on Halloween, the world of the living and the world of the dead, which was called the other world, came together on that night, the night between the old and the new years. Now, the dead could return to the places where they had lived. Many of the rituals provided for their visits hospitality for the dead ancestors. The Celts would put out food and drink for the dead, and they would have great ceremonies. They would leave their windows open, their doors unlocked, gates unlocked, to give the dead free passage into the home. They believed that the spirit world would be released into the land of the living on November Eve. Now, the problem with the spirits was not all of them were friendly. And so the Celts would carve the images of guardian spirits into turnips, and they would set these jack-o'-lanterns outside their doors or in their windows to keep out the unwelcome, unfriendly, malevolent visitors from the other world. They would also use the jack-o'-lanterns as they traveled at night to scare away evil spirits or mischievous fairies who might lead the traveler astray. This superstition is believed to either be Scottish or Irish in origin. In the American Halloween tradition, the pumpkin has replaced the gourds and the turnips as the jack-o'-lantern of choice, and it is iconic now with Halloween. Let's look at another tradition of Halloween, bobbing for apples. Now, according to one definition, divination or scrying is, quote, the art of foretelling future events or discovering things secret or obscure by the aid of superior beings or by certain rites, experiments, and observations. Divining the events of the coming year was a prominent feature then of Samhain, October 31st, summer's end. The Celts would use hazelnuts, which were symbols for wisdom. They used hazelnuts to foretell future events. Bobbing for apples was one of the ways the ancient Celts sought omens for the future. Now, bobbing for apples may well represent the remnants of a pagan baptism rite called seining, S-E-I-N-I-N-G. In this witchcraft initiation rite, the novice's eyes are blindfolded, hands are bound behind the back, and his head is immersed in the cauldron of water, which is the cauldron of regeneration. To represent the cauldron of regeneration, modern-day trick-or-treaters use a water-filled tub. Other Celtic legends state that bobbing for apples represents the biblical tree of knowledge and immortality. It was said that eating apples hung from strings enacted the battle of life and death. And at the heart of the Celtic otherworld, according to this legend, there grows an apple tree whose fruit has magical properties. Stories are told of heroes who would cross the western sea to find this wondrous country, known in Ireland as Evan Avlach, or in Britain as Avalon, a name we're more familiar with. At Samhain, the apple harvest is in. The old hearthside games, such as bobbing for apples, called apple duken in Scotland, reflected the journey across the water to obtain the magical apples. Now, some of the legends regarding the bobbing of the apples would come from Rome. where it was a superstitious thing that, especially among the young, whoever bit the apple first was going to be married first, that kind of thinking. And of course, the Celtic biblical tree of knowledge from the Bible, that's the Christian influence in some of that. And again, there's 2 or 3, origin stories about all of this, but ultimately it's rooted in some sort of superstition from the ancient past. In fact, one superstition states that if you walk backward into a room while looking into a mirror and eating an apple at the same time, you will see your future mate's face in the mirror's reflection. Another pagan divination ritual called the apple in the mirror. One modern practitioner describes the ritual as follows. Before the stroke of midnight, sit in front of a mirror in a room lit only by one candle or by the moon. Go into the silence and ask a question. Cut the apple into 9 pieces. With your back to the mirror, eat 8 of the pieces, then throw the 9th over your left shoulder. Turn your head to look over that same shoulder, and you will see an image or a symbol in the mirror that will tell you your answer. Another apple superstition states that by throwing an apple peel over your shoulder, you can determine the initial of your beloved by the shape of the apple peel as it lands on the floor. All right, what about trick-or-treating itself? In Celtic times, and even up until the medieval ages, fairies were thought to run free on Halloween. Fairies weren't necessarily evil, but they weren't very good either. They were just mischievous. They didn't like to be tricked or crossed, but they would reward good behavior. On Halloween, the fairies would disguise themselves as beggars and go door to door asking for handouts. Those who gave them food or treats were rewarded. Those who did not were subjected to some unpleasantness or tricks. There is another pagan association with trick-or-treating, and this one involves gifts for the dead. In the Encyclopedia of Occultism and Parapsychology, the practice of trick-or-treat has lost all conscious association with the older practice when fruit or candies were gained from neighbors, a relic of the custom of food offerings for the dead. The Celts believed that the spirits of those who died the previous year could not go to their final resting place until they were properly prepared with possessions such as food and drink, the things that they needed in life to survive, while the dead apparently need in the other world. A common Halloween tradition was to appease these spirits by sending them off to the other world by treating them. If the spirit was not treated well, then he would trick or haunt that particular household. And yet another tradition states that to trick or treat has been thought of to have come from a European custom called souling. Beggars would go from village to village begging for soul cakes made out of square pieces of bread with currants. The more soul cakes the beggars would receive, the more prayers they would promise to pray on behalf of the dead relatives of the donors. At the time, it was believed that the dead remained in limbo for a time after death, and that prayer, even by strangers, could guarantee a soul's passage to heaven. It's almost like getting someone out of purgatory in the Catholic religion. Well, in many parts of Britain and Ireland, this night, Samhain, Halloween, Summer's End, used to be known as Mischief Night, which meant that people were just free to go around the village playing pranks and getting into mischief without any fear of being punished. Many of these different customs then were taken to the United States by the Irish and Scottish immigrants in the 19th century, and some believe that it developed into trick-or-treat. Let's look at ghoulish costumes and ghost stories. It was believed that the spirits were able to assume grotesque appearances, and some traditions said that if you could costume yourself to look like a departed spirit, then that spirit would not be able to haunt or trick you. You would, in fact, be tricking the spirit. Bonfires. There are 2 variations to the origin of bonfires. One legend states that on Samhain or Halloween, villagers would go and gather the best of the autumn harvest and slaughter cattle for the annual feast. I mean, it was the days before refrigeration. You would slaughter many of your animals, salt them, prepare them for the winter to be consumed, and then sheltering just a few of the healthier livestock animals for the spring. So at summer's end, they would gather the autumn harvest and slaughter the cattle for this annual feast. Now the focus of each village's festivals or festivities was centered around a large bonfire. The villagers would cast the bones of the slaughtered cattle into the roaring flames. And with the bonfire or the bone fire roaring, the villagers would then extinguish all other fires. And each family would solemnly light their hearth from this one great common flame, which served to bind or bond all the families of the village together. According to this tradition, then, again, the word bonfire comes from these bone fires. That's just one tradition. Another tradition states that Samhain bonfires, or Baal fires, fires offered to the pagan god Baal, were lit on every hilltop in Britain and Ireland as soon as the sun set on October 31st. The word Baal fire comes from the word boon, which means extra. The fires serve the purpose of containing the energy of the dead god, lighting the dark night, warding off evil, ushering in the light of the new year, purifying the ritual space or the home, and bringing the focus of the ritual to bear. So in many parts of the British Isles, these Baal fires, or boon fires, or if they're just strictly Baal, the god Baal fires, they're still lit on Halloween in honor of the old ways. Let's turn our attention back to some ghost stories and the dead. The telling of ghost stories is very much part of the Halloween tradition. In fact, it was part of the Christmas tradition in England for many years, and maybe still is. But ghost stories definitely part of the Halloween tradition. Marion Green, in her book Magic for the Aquarian Age, explains that Halloween is a time for ghosts and weird stories, but as a pagan rite, it is a time when the dead and the living and the unborn children step outside the circle of time to meet, to talk, and to exchange information. The door of the circle is left open, and a place is laid with rich food and wine to be offered to the goddess when she joins her worshippers, who are her children. It is said that since the veil between the realms of the living and the dead is at its thinnest on Halloween, it is also a prime time to attempt to contact the spirit realm and communicate with your departed loved ones. Attempting to communicate with the dead is called necromancy. And as you can see from all this that we looked at, various pagan influences have been incorporated into the American tradition of Halloween. However, its origins overall are primary, ancient, Celtic, and it's the celebration of Samhain that was brought to America by the Irish immigrants of the 19th century. Now, in the next section, just three more pages to go here. In the next section, we will briefly survey how new pagans of today keep the ancient festival of Halloween, because it is, for the pagans, still an important holiday. Neo-pagans is what we'll call them. It's what they're called. Neo-pagans means new pagan, and the term describes the recent revival of the old pagan religions of earth worship. Now, included in this group are Wiccans, Wicca witchcraft, Druidism, and even Satanism. Druidism is basically a revival of the old Celtic religion, whereas Wicca has incorporated many different traditions, some of which are new, based on personal preference, such as witches like former witch Gerald Gardner, and of course Ray Buckland that I quoted earlier. Gardner, his witchcraft is Gardnerian witchcraft, and Raymond Buckland's is called Saxon witchcraft. Now, Raymond Buckland was also a practitioner of Gardnerian witchcraft in his day. Yep, both modern Druidism and Wicca celebrate Halloween basically the same way. So two groups are different. Druidism is different from Wicca, but they both look at Halloween as basically the same holiday. It's a time to remember the dead, to divine the future, and to tie up any loose ends before the new year. So let's consider Wicca witchcraft. Wicca is called witchcraft, or as they describe themselves, the craft. Wicca is rooted in the ancient Celtic religion from which Halloween is derived, as we've looked at. And like the Celts, the year ends for the Wiccan on October 31st. Samhain, as they call it, they don't call it Halloween, they call it Samhain, is said to be the period of time when the gates between the worlds are least guarded and the veils their thinnest. It's a time for dimensional openings and the time to remember and celebrate the passing of loved ones. Halloween, or Samhain for the Wiccan, is a very somber holiday, one of dark clothes and thoughts for the dead. It is said to be a time when those of the necromantic arts can even speak with the dead. Necromancy is speaking with the dead. It is a time for ending relationships and bad situations, and it's a time when one can see a glimmer of hope for the future. One Wiccan describes it as, quote, "This is the time of the year for getting rid of weaknesses. Coveners." Coven is a witch's meaning. Coveners should bring into the circle with them a small piece of parchment on which they have written down weaknesses or bad habits they would like to lose. Then follows an enchantment of a seasonal motif. Here are some examples: life and death, new life, death of the old king, crowning of the new, the turning of the wheel of the year, the killing off of those animals, the cattle that would not survive the winter, return of the dead to rejoice briefly with the living, gathering of the harvest and stories for the winter, creation of the world with chaos transformed into order. To witches, Halloween is one of the 4 high holidays, or as it is sometimes called, a great Sabbat. According to the Zondervan Guide to Cults and Religious Movements, a Sabbat is one of 8 annual festivals of witchcraft and Satanism. 4 correspond to the solstices and equinoxes, and 4, called Grand Sabbats, occur midway between the solstices and equinoxes. So you have Samhain on November Eve, Beltane on May Eve. You have Lunasa, which marks the beginning of the harvest season, and Imbolc, which marks the beginning of spring. Modern Wiccan witch Selena Fox, in an article entitled "Celebrating the Seasons, Lore and Ritual," explains how she, as a Wiccan witch, celebrates Samhain, or Halloween. For most Wiccan practitioners, Halloween is the new year and a time for letting go of old and looking ahead to the new. It marks the end of the harvest season. Since ancient times, pagans have paid their respects to departed loved ones, ancestors, and guides in the spirit world at Samhain. The goddess manifests as the crone, and the god as the horned hunter and death and lord of death. Sacred colors are black and orange. It is the festival of endings and transformation. Set up an altar in your home to honor departed loved ones and ancestors, or if you already have such an altar, place offerings and light a candle there. As done in ancient times, set a place at your table for your spirit friends and relatives, and serve them some of the food and drink you share at your Samhain feast. Throw a come-as-you-were party, and have everyone dress up as they were in another life. Here, of course, speaking of reincarnation. Set lighted, carved pumpkins around your home to bless it. Magically make a resolution to break out of a negative habit or begin a healthier way of being. Do divination on the year ahead. So Wiccans, however, are not the only neo-pagan groups that celebrate Halloween as a magical time of the year. For Satanists, Halloween is one of the major 5 holidays. So let's look at Satan very quickly. Unlike Wicca, Samhain is not the most important holiday for Satanists. The most important holiday for Satanists is their own birthday, because they're celebrating their own self, their own God. God is self to the Satanists. The self is the most important person in Satanism. Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan and author of the Satanic Bible, states, "The highest of all holidays in the Satanic religion is the date of one's own birth." The Satanist feels, why not really be honest? And if you're going to create a God in your own image, why not create that God as yourself? Every man is a God if he chooses to recognize himself as one. So says Anton LaVey. Although Halloween is not the primary holy day, that's what holiday means. Halloween's not the primary holy day for a Satanist, holy day. It is commonly celebrated, but is usually far less occultically significant as it is for the Wiccans. Halloween is a popular date for private or group ritual ceremonies, and it's also a popular day for Satanists to hold private parties for no other purpose than to enjoy the dark fun that is commonly celebrated on that day. If anything, according to one source, Satanists seem to take a sense of irony and humor in the holiday. Alright, so let's wind this down by looking at Christians and Halloween. In the United States, Halloween is one of the most celebrated holidays of the year. It's observed by Christians, neo-pagans such as Wiccans, Druids, and Satanists, and by the secular culture at large. For most people, Halloween is nothing more than a party. However, you can't get away from the fact that Halloween is almost exclusively based on the ancient Celtic celebration of Samhain. Halloween traditions such as the jack-o'-lantern, trick-or-treating, witches riding their magical broomsticks continue to visually reflect the holiday's pagan origins. Now, with the revival of the old religion among the neo-pagans of our day, the gap between Halloween's pagan origins and the modern celebration is less distant. In light of the obvious paganism that is associated with Halloween, the Christian needs to give serious thought about their participation. This means that you must think biblically about Halloween. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 through 13, we read these words from God's Word. When you enter into the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nation there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire.